All right, let's jump right in. We're talking about tithing today. Now, this is an ancient idea, right? But what's really fascinating is how much it's changed over thousands of years. It went from being this strict command to something totally different, more of a guiding principle.
So this is the big question, isn't it? That 10% number. Is it a hard and fast rule that applies to everyone for all time? It's something a lot of us wonder about. And to really get to the bottom of it, we've got to go way back to the beginning. So let's start with the word itself, tithe. It's pretty simple, actually. It comes from this Hebrew word ma'aser, which literally just means a tenth part. Easy enough, right? But oh man, how that simple idea has been applied? Well, that's been a huge point of debate for centuries. Okay, so to really get this, our first stop has to be the Old Testament. And let me tell you, back then, this was no suggestion. It was a mandatory, super-structured system. You could almost think of it like a national tax for the nation of Israel. And its main purpose was actually super practical. See, the religious leaders, the Levites and priests, they weren't given any land of their own. No farms, no way to make a living in an agricultural society. So how did they survive? The tithe. It was their support system, the thing that kept the entire spiritual infrastructure of the nation running. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because it wasn't just one single 10% payment. Nope. The Law of Moses actually talks about 3 different tithes. There was one for the Levites, another one for big national religious festivals, and then a third one, collected every 3 years, that was basically a social safety net for the poor. But get this, the idea of giving a tenth actually existed before the Law of Moses. We see people like Abraham and Jacob doing it, but here's the crucial difference. For them, it was totally voluntary. It was a personal act of worship, a way of saying thank you. It wasn't a rule they had to follow. That all changed, of course, once the law came along. And you better believe this was a serious obligation. I mean, listen to the prophet Malachi. He uses some incredibly strong language. He basically says that when people didn't bring their tithes, they weren't just being disobedient, they were literally robbing God. That shows you just how central this whole system was to their national identity and their relationship with God. So, if there's one thing to take away from this look at the Old Testament, it's this. For ancient Israel, tithing was a required, structured part of their law. It was not optional, period. All right, so we've established that baseline, a mandatory system. Now let's jump forward to the New Testament, because this is where things take a huge turn. The focus completely shifts, moving away from an external rule to something internal, a principle of the heart. And Jesus himself talks about tithing. But what's fascinating is how he talks about it. He wasn't there to double down on the percentage. Instead, he calls out the religious leaders who were, ticking all the boxes perfectly, but they were completely missing the point. They were ignoring the really important stuff: justice, mercy, faithfulness. He was all about the why behind the what. And you see this shift play out across the rest of the New Testament. You can read through all the letters written to the early churches, and you know what you won't find? A single command for Christians to give a 10% tithe. That specific mandate, it's just gone. So if the 10% rule is gone, what takes its place? Anarchy? No, not at all. Instead of a rule, we get a new set of principles, mostly from the Apostle Paul. He talks about giving that's proportional, in keeping with what you make. It should be willing and cheerful, never because you feel forced. And the why is still there, to support the ministry and to take care of people who are in need. This one verse really nails the new mindset. It says each person should give what they've decided in their own heart to give. The decision-making process literally moves from a rulebook into your own heart. It's not about checking a box anymore. It's a joyful, personal response, an overflow of gratitude. Okay, so let's put it all together. How do we summarize this massive transformation? How did we go from what was essentially a national tax for Israel to this personal principle of generosity for people all over the world? I mean, look at this. The change is crystal clear. The requirement goes from being mandatory, a legal thing, to being totally voluntary. The amount goes from a specific 10%, actually multiple 10%, to just being proportional, no set number. And maybe most importantly, the attitude shifts from an act of obedience to the law to an act of worship that comes from a cheerful heart. It's a night and day difference. So the big takeaway here is just how much this concept evolved. It went from being an external, national rule for one specific nation to being an internal, personal principle of generosity that's driven by grace and meant for everyone, everywhere. And that kind of leaves us with a final question, one that's a lot more personal. If it's no longer about hitting a specific number, that forces us to ask a much bigger, maybe even harder question. What does radical, cheerful, from the heart generosity actually look like for you today?